Welcome to History Whispers, where history meets ideas. I'm your host, Emma Carter, and today we step into the world of one of the most incredible minds in Western thought, Aristotle. A student of Plato, a tutor to Alexander the Great, and a towering figure in philosophy, science, and politics. Joining me is our esteemed guest, Dr. Rhys Morgana, classicist and philosopher. Dr. Morgana, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Dr. Rhys, let's begin at the start. Who was Aristotle? Can you walk us through his early life and how he came to study with Plato?
Absolutely, Emma. Aristotle's life is as fascinating as his philosophy. He was born in 384 BCE in a small town called Stagira, located in northern Greece in the region of Macedonia. His father, Nicomachus, was the personal physician to King Amyntas of Macedon, the grandfather of Alexander the Great. This early exposure to medicine and court life likely influenced Aristotle's later interest in biology, observation, and political structure. When Aristotle was about 17 years old, he moved to Athens, the intellectual hub of the ancient world, and joined Plato's Academy, the most prestigious school of philosophy at the time. He spent 20 years there as both a student and later a teacher. During that time, he developed a deep respect for Plato, but also began to diverge from some of his teacher's core ideas. Aristotle, breaking away from the academy after Plato's death. After leaving Athens, Aristotle traveled extensively. He spent time in Asia Minor, Lesbos, and eventually accepted an invitation from King Philip II of Macedon to become the tutor of his son, Alexander, the future conqueror of the known world. This tutoring relationship is one of history's most extraordinary educational moments, the greatest philosopher of his time teaching the man who would become one of the greatest military leaders in history. Later in life, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. There, he continued to teach, write, and research until the political climate turned against Macedonians following Alexander's death. Facing potential persecution, Aristotle left Athens, reportedly saying that he would not allow the city to sin twice against philosophy, a reference to Socrates' fate. He died in 322 BCE, at the age of 62. But his writings, covering logic, biology, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and more, laid the groundwork for entire disciplines. His influence endured not just for centuries, but for millennia, shaping both the Islamic Golden Age and the Western Enlightenment. So when we talk about Aristotle, we're not just talking about a philosopher. We're talking about a foundational figure in the history of human thought. A man whose intellect helped shape the very way we understand reality.
Thank you, Dr. Rhys, for such a comprehensive introduction of Aristotle. We'll be diving into Aristotle's teachings very soon, but before we go there, a question has been lingering in my mind. We discussed Plato's Academy in detail during one of our earlier episodes, and for our listeners, if you haven't listened to that yet, I highly recommend checking it out for some fascinating context. So here's what I'm wondering. Aristotle spent about 20 years at the Academy, and yet he left. Why? Was it purely philosophical disagreement, or is there truth to the idea that he wasn't satisfied with the direction the Academy took after Plato's death, particularly under his successor? Can you elaborate on the reasons behind Aristotle's departure?
That's an excellent and often overlooked question, Emma. Yes, Aristotle did indeed spend 2 remarkable decades at Plato's Academy, and while his departure is frequently attributed to intellectual differences, there's more to the story. First, let's consider the philosophical divergence. Plato's philosophy was rooted in the existence of eternal abstract forms, ideal templates of reality that existed in a realm beyond our physical world. Aristotle, while deeply respectful of Plato, gradually grew critical of this idea. He believed that reality was not separate from our experience, but embedded within it. He argued that form and substance are united, that we understand what a thing is by observing its function, its structure, and its purpose within the material world. This was a fundamental shift, and it created an intellectual gap that Aristotle likely found increasingly uncomfortable. But there's also the political and institutional dimension. When Plato died around 347 BCE, the leadership of the Academy passed to Speusippus, who was Plato's nephew. This decision might have caused some tension. Aristotle was not only a senior member of the Academy, but also one of its most brilliant minds. Yet the succession followed a kind of familial line, which may have felt more like nepotism than a merit-based decision. Historical sources don't explicitly say Aristotle was angry or bitter, but it's widely believed that he was not fully aligned with Speusippus's vision for the academy. There may have been disagreements over the direction the school was taking, both in terms of leadership style and philosophical orientation. In fact, Speusippus had some quite esoteric ideas that diverged even from Plato, including mystical numerical theories, and Aristotle, being a methodical and empirical thinker, probably saw the academy moving away from the kind of rigorous inquiry he valued. There's one more important factor to consider: the political climate in Athens. Aristotle was Macedonian by birth, and around the time Plato died, anti-Macedonian sentiment was on the rise in Athens. With the growing power of King Philip II of Macedon and later Alexander the Great, Athenians were increasingly wary of Macedonian influence. Aristotle, being closely connected to the Macedonian court, may have found it politically prudent, even necessary, to leave. So, to summarize, Aristotle's departure from the academy was not a simple exit. It was the result of a growing philosophical disagreement with Platonic thought, possible discontent with the academy's leadership under Speusippus, and a shifting political atmosphere that made Athens less hospitable for someone with Macedonian ties. After leaving, Aristotle traveled and continued his studies independently, and of course later founded his own school, the Lyceum, where his intellectual legacy truly flourished.
All right. That adds a lot of context. Now, something else I've always been curious about. Aristotle eventually became the tutor of Alexander the Great, which is such a legendary pairing. But how did that come to be? How did King Philip II, Alexander's father, come to know about Aristotle? How did he reach out to him, and where exactly was Aristotle at that time when he received the invitation?
That's a fascinating thread to pull, Emma, because the connection between Aristotle and the royal Macedonian court is one of those incredible moments in history where philosophy meets power, quite literally. After leaving Plato's academy, Aristotle spent several years traveling across Asia Minor, particularly in Assos and Lesbos. During this time, he immersed himself in biological studies, particularly the classification of marine life, some of which would later form the foundation of his contributions to zoology and natural science. Now, it was during this period, sometime around 343 BCE, that King Philip II of Macedon extended an invitation to Aristotle. But how did Philip even know about him? Well, Aristotle wasn't unknown in the Macedonian court. His father, Nicomachus, had served as court physician to Philip's father, King Amyntas. This meant that Aristotle was not only Macedonian by birth, but already familiar to the royal family through heritage and reputation. More importantly, by this time, Aristotle's intellectual achievements had started gaining wider recognition across the Greek world. He was known as a formidable thinker and teacher. Philip II had grand ambitions for his son Alexander. He didn't want him educated solely as a warrior or politician. He wanted him trained in philosophy, science, and leadership, someone who could rule not just with strength, but with wisdom. So, who better than Aristotle? When the invitation reached Aristotle, he was likely in Lesbos, continuing his natural studies. According to some historical accounts, Philip offered generous terms, including funding and the restoration of Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which had been destroyed by Philip's army earlier. As part of the deal, Philip reportedly rebuilt the city and repopulated it as a gesture of goodwill to Aristotle. And so Aristotle accepted. He traveled to the Macedonian capital, Pella, and began tutoring the young prince, Alexander, who at that time was only about 13 years old. It was a remarkable convergence of intellect and ambition. Aristotle didn't just teach him philosophy and ethics. He introduced him to science, literature, logic, and politics. It's no exaggeration to say that some of the seeds of Alexander's later vision of a multicultural, knowledge-driven empire were planted in those formative lessons. So the answer to your question, Emma, is that Aristotle was already a name of considerable weight, and his familial ties to the Macedonian court, combined with his growing reputation, made him the ideal candidate for one of the most important teaching roles in history.
That's absolutely fascinating, Dr. Rhys. And staying with this remarkable relationship, the bond between Aristotle and Alexander, I'd love to go a bit deeper. What do we really know about their connection as teacher and student? Was it a close intellectual relationship, a formal one, or something more personal? Did Aristotle ever write anything about Alexander that survives? And there's something else I'd like you to clarify. A popular myth, or maybe a misunderstood story. After Alexander became king and began expanding his empire, some accounts describe him becoming more tyrannical or godlike. Is it true that Aristotle disapproved of his actions? I've even heard claims that Aristotle may have wanted him removed or dead. Is there any truth to that, or is it just legend?
A powerful and important set of questions, Emma, and ones that often get clouded by myth, speculation, and centuries of historical interpretation. The relationship between Aristotle and Alexander is one of history's most captivating intellectual pairings. And like all such stories, it's layered and complex. Let's start with the bond between the teacher and the student. When Aristotle began tutoring Alexander, the young prince was about 13 years old, deeply impressionable, but already showing signs of ambition and intensity. Aristotle didn't just teach him rhetoric and philosophy. He gave him a comprehensive education in ethics, politics, logic, natural science, medicine, and even art. The curriculum wasn't casual. It was designed to create a philosopher king, someone who could rule wisely and justly, in the tradition of Plato's ideal leader. Their relationship was close, particularly during those early years. Aristotle is said to have had great affection for Alexander, and Alexander reportedly respected Aristotle deeply, even sending him plant and animal specimens during his campaigns to aid Aristotle's scientific studies. That suggests a lasting intellectual bond even as Alexander marched across Asia. As for writings about Alexander, unfortunately, none of Aristotle's personal letters or reflections on Alexander survive in full. There are fragments and references in later sources, but we don't have a complete work by Aristotle specifically about his student. What we do have, though, are writings like Politics and Ethics, where Aristotle outlines his vision of just rule and moral leadership, and many scholars believe these ideas were directly shaped by, and perhaps aimed at, Alexander. Now, about the rumors of tension and betrayal, that's where things get murky. It is true that as Alexander grew more powerful, he began adopting divine status, accepting worship, and ruling with an increasingly autocratic style. This would have been at odds with Aristotle's view of moderation and balanced governance. Aristotle valued reason, civic virtue, and the rule of law, not the cult of personality or unchecked empire building. Some historical sources do suggest that Aristotle criticized Alexander privately and may have become disillusioned with the man his student became. There were even whispers, especially in later Roman and Byzantine sources, that Aristotle had a hand in poisoning Alexander or that he encouraged others to do so. But these claims are highly speculative and not supported by credible contemporary evidence. Most historians believe that while Aristotle may have disagreed with Alexander's methods, there is no reliable evidence that he ever plotted against him or wished him dead. Those rumors likely reflect political tensions of the time, especially after Alexander's death, when being associated with him could be dangerous or controversial. So, to sum up, their bond began as one of deep respect and shared vision. Over time, as Alexander's ambitions grew and his worldview shifted, it's likely that their philosophies diverged. But the idea that Aristotle wanted Alexander dead, that belongs more to legend than to documented history. Still, the fact that such a myth exists is telling. It speaks to the enduring power of their story and the complicated dance between power and wisdom, ambition and ethics that still fascinates us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for clearing that up, Dr. Rhys. It really helps to separate myth from history. Now, shifting gears a little, let's talk philosophy. Aristotle is considered one of the foundational figures in Western thought, and his ideas have shaped entire disciplines. Can you walk us through his core philosophical notions? What were the central concepts he introduced, and what do they actually mean in practical or theoretical terms?
Absolutely, Emma. When we talk about Aristotle's philosophy, we're not just referring to abstract ideas. We're talking about a system of thought that deeply influenced logic, science, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and even how we think about thinking. Aristotle wasn't a philosopher in an ivory tower. He was a system builder, a truth seeker, and above all, a realist. He wanted to understand the world as it is, not as we imagine it to be. Let me walk you through some of his core philosophical notions and what they mean. The first is the four causes. One of Aristotle's most fundamental ideas is his theory of four causes, which explains why things exist or happen. According to him, to fully understand anything, we must ask 4 types of questions. 1. Material cause. What is it made of? For example, a statue is made of marble. 2. Formal cause. What is its form or essence? For example, the shape of the statue. 3. Efficient cause. Who or what made it? For example, the sculptor. 4. Final cause. What is its purpose or function? Example, to honor a god or beautify a space. The final cause, or telos, is especially important. Aristotle believed everything in nature has a purpose, and understanding that purpose is key to understanding its true nature. The second notion, his philosophy, is hylomorphism, matter and form. Aristotle rejected Plato's idea that forms existed in a separate, perfect realm. Instead, he proposed hylomorphism, the idea that everything in the physical world is a combination of matter and form. For instance, a tree is not just wood or matter, but also treeness, the shape, structure, and purpose that make it a tree and not a table. This concept grounded his metaphysics in the here and now, making him one of the earliest empiricists, someone who believed knowledge comes from observation and experience. The third notion, his philosophy, is the doctrine of the mean, or ethics. In ethics, Aristotle's most influential concept is the golden mean. He believed that virtue lies between 2 extremes, excess and deficiency. For example, courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity is the mean between wastefulness and stinginess. He taught that moral virtue is a habit, something developed through practice, not inherited or simply understood. Living ethically means cultivating balance and self-awareness and striving for excellence, or arete, in all things. Now about the fourth notion, it is called logic and the syllogism. Aristotle is often called the father of formal logic. His system of deductive reasoning, especially the syllogism, became the backbone of Western logic for over 1,000 years. A syllogism is a form of argument, such as, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This method of structured reasoning laid the groundwork for philosophy, mathematics, and science alike. The fifth notion is the unmoved mover, which is related to metaphysics and theology. In his search for the ultimate cause of motion and existence, Aristotle introduced the concept of the unmoved mover, a being that causes all motion in the universe without itself being moved by anything else. This was his philosophical version of a first cause or prime reality, something eternal, perfect, and purely actual. While not a personal God in the religious sense, Aristotle's unmoved mover had a profound influence on later theological thought, especially in medieval Islamic and Christian philosophy. Number 6 is political philosophy. Aristotle believed that humans are political animals, naturally inclined to live in communities. He categorized different forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, polity, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, arguing that the best government promotes the common good and encourages virtue among its citizens. He didn't idealize politics. Instead, he analyzed what works, what sustains societies, and what corrupts them. In summary, Emma, Aristotle's philosophy is vast, but it all revolves around a few key ideas. Everything has a purpose. Knowledge begins with the senses. Virtue is found in balance. Reason is the guide to the good life. And even after 2,300 years, those ideas still help us ask better questions, live more thoughtfully, and understand our world with greater clarity.
Wow, Dr. Rhys, that was incredibly insightful. Honestly, listening to you explain Aristotle's philosophy like that makes me feel that if we really tried to unpack all of it, we wouldn't just need more podcast episodes, we probably need years. Would you agree that Aristotle's body of work is so vast and foundational that truly covering it all could take a lifetime of study?
Absolutely, Emma. You're spot on. Aristotle's work spans ethics, logic, metaphysics, politics, biology, psychology, rhetoric, and more. It's no exaggeration to say that entire university departments are built around just fragments of his thought. Scholars have spent their entire lives studying a single aspect of his philosophy. So yes, to truly grasp the depth and breadth of Aristotle, it's a lifelong journey, not just a podcast.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Rhys. So while we may not have years, we'll certainly do our best to explore as much as we can within our time today. Now that we've covered Aristotle's core philosophy, I'd love to shift the focus to Aristotle as a scientist. He's often referred to as the father of several scientific disciplines. So could you shed some light on that? What were the main scientific fields Aristotle contributed to, and what makes his work in science so foundational even today?
Absolutely, Emma, and that's a crucial dimension of Aristotle that often doesn't get enough spotlight. While most people know him as a philosopher, Aristotle was equally, if not more, a scientist in spirit and practice. In fact, he's rightly referred to as the father of several scientific disciplines because he was among the first to observe, record, and classify the natural world. Let's break it down a bit. 1. Biology and zoology. Aristotle's most enduring scientific work was in biology, particularly in zoology. While living on the island of Lesbos, he studied marine life and documented over 500 species of animals, many of which he classified in strikingly accurate detail. He dissected animals and carefully recorded anatomical features, a practice that predated modern biology by almost 2,000 years. His classification system, though rudimentary by today's standards, was the first known attempt to group animals based on similarities. In fact, some of his anatomical observations, like those on the development of chick embryos, were so precise that they remained unchallenged for centuries. 2. Physics and natural philosophy. Now, Aristotle's physics isn't what we'd call modern physics, but in his time, it was revolutionary. He proposed that the universe was made up of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and that all motion had a natural cause and direction. For example, he believed that heavy objects naturally fall toward the center of the earth, while fire rises toward the heavens. He also introduced the idea of a 5th element, called aether, which he believed made up the stars and celestial bodies. Though many of his ideas were later corrected by Newton and Galileo, Aristotle's insistence on cause and effect relationships in nature laid the foundation for the scientific method itself. 3. Logic and scientific reasoning. Aristotle's work in logic, especially his development of deductive reasoning and syllogisms, became the formal structure behind scientific thinking for centuries. His logical methods allowed scholars to form hypotheses, test ideas, and build coherent systems of knowledge. This approach deeply influenced medieval Islamic and Christian scholars who used Aristotle's logic to advance fields like astronomy, medicine, and theology. 4. Psychology and the human mind. Interestingly, Aristotle was also a pioneer in early psychology. In his work, De Anima, On the Soul, he described the soul as the form of the body and categorized the soul's faculties: nutritive, plants; sensitive, animals; and rational, humans. This formed the earliest naturalistic view of consciousness. 5. Meteorology and earth sciences. Yes, Aristotle even ventured into meteorology. He wrote extensively about the weather, geology, earthquakes, and celestial phenomena, trying to explain rainbows, winds, and the motion of the heavens based on observable evidence. While many of his conclusions were off the mark, the effort to explain the natural world through reason and observation rather than myth was groundbreaking. In summary, Emma, Aristotle's contribution to science lies not in always being right, but in asking the right questions, observing the world systematically, and insisting that nature could be understood through reason. That mindset of curiosity, rigor, and classification remains at the heart of modern science. He truly was a bridge between myth and method, turning wonder into wisdom and observation into knowledge.
Truly incredible, Dr. Rhys. I mean, listening to you, it feels like Aristotle was nothing short of an encyclopedia of his time, a living treasure of knowledge. That's honestly how I've begun to perceive him after hearing all of this. Now, shifting to something very close to human behavior and purpose, let's talk about his views on ethics and the good life. What were Aristotle's core principles in this area? What did he believe a person must do or follow to become a good individual, a virtuous citizen, and to live an ethical and meaningful life?
Emma, I have to say, I really appreciated how you described Aristotle as the encyclopedia of his time. That's honestly quite an apt way to put it. He wasn't just touching one discipline, he was weaving together strands of science, logic, politics, metaphysics, ethics, essentially trying to build a comprehensive framework for understanding everything. And yes, he was absolutely a living library of knowledge for his era, with a depth that continues to guide us even today. Now, coming to his ethics and the good life, which I think is one of the most profound and relatable parts of Aristotle's philosophy. At the heart of his ethical thinking is the idea of eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but is more accurately described as human flourishing. It's about living a life of excellence, purpose, and fulfillment, not chasing momentary pleasures, but becoming the best version of yourself over time. 1. Eudaimonia, the purpose of life. Aristotle believed that every action we take is aimed at some good, but the highest good, the one we seek for its own sake, is eudaimonia. It's not about wealth, fame, or even comfort. It's about living a life that realizes our rational and moral potential. A life where our thoughts, choices, and actions are in harmony. 2. The doctrine of the mean. One of his best-known ethical ideas is the doctrine of the mean, which tells us that virtue lies between two extremes. Not too much, not too little, but just enough, in balance. For example, courage is the mean between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between extravagance and stinginess. Humility is between self-deprecation and boastfulness. This mean isn't a strict middle, it's a contextual balance, depending on the person and the situation. 3. Virtue through habit. Another essential point, Aristotle didn't believe we are born virtuous. Instead, virtue is developed through habit. Just like we learn to play an instrument by practicing daily, we become good by doing good things regularly. He emphasized the role of discipline, consistency, and intentional practice. You don't become just or wise or courageous overnight. You become that way by living it again and again. 4. Intellectual and moral virtues. Aristotle also separated virtues into two broad types. Moral virtues, like patience, honesty, and bravery, developed through behavior and habituation. Intellectual virtues, like wisdom, reason, and insight, developed through learning and contemplation. He argued that a flourishing life needs both the heart and the mind working together. 5. Practical wisdom, or phronesis. Perhaps one of his most remarkable contributions is the idea of practical wisdom, or phronesis. This is the ability to make good decisions in real-life situations, to navigate life's complexities with thoughtfulness and integrity. It's not just knowing what's good, but knowing how to apply that good in a way that fits the moment, the people involved, and the bigger picture. 6. Ethics and society. Aristotle didn't see ethics as a private matter. He believed humans are social creatures, what he called political animals. For him, a good life includes being a responsible citizen, contributing to the well-being of the community, and participating in civic life with fairness and justice. So yes, Emma, to live ethically for Aristotle wasn't about blind obedience or rigid rules. It was about cultivating inner excellence, understanding yourself deeply, and striving with sincerity towards a life of harmony, balance, and virtue. In today's world,
full of noise, extremes, and uncertainty, his message is timeless. Real happiness comes not from having more, but from becoming more.
Now, Dr. Rhys, let's transition into another important facet of Aristotle's thought: politics and governance. As we discussed in our previous episodes, Plato believed that the best kind of ruler was a philosopher king, someone who ruled with wisdom and reason. But what did Aristotle think? What were his views on political systems, good governance, and who, in his eyes, should ideally lead a society? We'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to understand how Aristotle's political theory compares to his teacher's vision.
A truly foundational question, Emma, and one that opens up an entirely different side of Aristotle's intellect. While he was deeply influenced by Plato, Aristotle took a more practical and grounded approach to politics. He didn't deal in ideal states that exist in theory. He analyzed real governments, real societies, and real leaders to determine what works, what fails, and what allows humans to flourish. Now, you mentioned Plato's philosopher king, a concept Aristotle admired in theory but viewed as largely impractical. Aristotle believed that political power shouldn't rely solely on idealism or intellect, but on a system that supports the common good, cultivates virtue, and balances law, reason, and citizen participation. 1. Humans as political animals. Let's begin with a quote from Aristotle himself. Quote, "Man is by nature a political animal." This simple line captures his belief that humans thrive in communities. We're not meant to live in isolation. In fact, he argued that it is only within a polis, or city-state, that humans can truly achieve their potential. To Aristotle, politics wasn't just about ruling or governance, it was about ethics on a societal scale. A good political system, in his view, helps people live virtuously. 2. Purpose of the state. Aristotle believed the state exists not just to preserve life, but to enhance it. Unlike modern views that often separate politics from morality, Aristotle saw moral development and civic engagement as intertwined. The goal of the polis was to educate its citizens, shape their character, and create a space where the pursuit of virtue could thrive. A good government, then, is not one that merely enforces order, but one that nurtures the soul of the citizenry. 3. Types of governments. Aristotle famously categorized governments into 6 types, divided into good and bad forms. Monarchy, ruled by one for the common good. Aristocracy, ruled by a few virtuous citizens. Polity, ruled by many for the common good, a kind of constitutional democracy. And their corrupt counterparts. Tyranny, ruled by one for personal gain. Oligarchy, ruled by a few for the wealthy elite. And democracy, in its degraded form, ruled by the majority for their own interest, often leading to mob rule. Of all these, Aristotle favored polity, a mixed government that blended democracy and oligarchy, creating a balance of power and protecting against both extremes. 4. Who should rule? So, who, in Aristotle's view, should rule? Ideally, those who possess practical wisdom, phronesis, and are committed to the common good. Unlike Plato, he didn't insist on philosophers as kings, but he did believe rulers should be educated, virtuous, and guided by reason and law. He warned against both absolute democracy and absolute monarchy, instead advocating for rule of law, institutional balance, and active civic participation. Interestingly, he was among the first to stress the middle class as key to stable governance. He believed that a strong, engaged middle class was less likely to abuse power and more invested in social harmony. 5. Citizenship and responsibility. For Aristotle, to be a citizen wasn't just a legal status, it was a moral duty. Citizens should not only obey laws, but shape them, debate them, and live by them ethically. Politics was seen as a means for moral education and societal growth, not just administration. In conclusion, Emma, Aristotle's vision of politics is deeply ethical, rational, and inclusive. He wasn't dreaming of utopias. He was observing human nature and building a practical roadmap for just governance. And even today, his insights into balanced power, civic responsibility, and the role of virtue in leadership are remarkably relevant. They remind us that good government doesn't just protect, it uplifts.
and that leaders aren't defined by their authority alone, but by their commitment to the good of all.
Dr. Rhys, honestly, the more I hear about Aristotle, the more I feel in awe. He truly was a legend, not just for his time, but for all time. Okay, so now I'd love to learn more about the school he founded, the Lyceum. Where exactly was it located? How long did it remain operational after Aristotle's time? And do any ruins or remnants of the Lyceum still exist today for people to visit or study?
Yes, Emma. The Lyceum. It's one of the most iconic places in the history of learning, and its story is both fascinating and a little bittersweet. Aristotle founded the Lyceum around 335 BCE after returning to Athens from his time tutoring Alexander the Great. He didn't simply want to create another version of Plato's academy. He envisioned a place where knowledge would be built on observation, debate, and wide-ranging inquiry. The Lyceum was located just outside the eastern walls of Athens, near a grove of trees that had been dedicated to Apollo Lyceus, hence the name. It wasn't a grand marble structure like some might imagine. Instead, it was a modest, open-air school surrounded by gardens and shaded walkways. Aristotle and his students would walk while they discussed, giving rise to the term peripatetic school, from the Greek word peripatein, meaning to walk around. How long did it operate? The Lyceum remained active long after Aristotle's death in 322 BCE. His immediate successors, like Theophrastus, continued his work and expanded the school's intellectual horizons. The Lyceum evolved into a major center of scientific, philosophical, and literary scholarship, functioning for centuries under various leaders. It wasn't just a place for lectures. It had one of the first organized libraries in history, and possibly the earliest known system of academic research. Scholars wrote treatises, conducted experiments, and preserved Aristotle's legacy with remarkable devotion. However, over time, particularly during Roman occupation and later during the rise of Christianity, the school's prominence declined. By around the 6th century CE, formal operations had ceased, and the site was largely forgotten. Are there ruins today? Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting. For centuries, the exact location of the Lyceum was unknown. But in 1996, during construction work in Athens, archaeologists uncovered its remains, remarkably well-preserved foundations and fragments that matched ancient descriptions of the Lyceum's layout. Today, the site is open to the public, nestled in the heart of modern Athens, not far from the Hellenic Parliament and the National Garden. It's a serene, almost poetic space, shaded by olive trees with interpretive signs explaining its history. It's not monumental in appearance, but when you stand there, you're standing on the ground where Aristotle walked, taught, and changed the course of human knowledge. That quiet hum of intellectual history still echoes. So, yes, Emma, the Lyceum lives on, not just in stone, but in every university, research institute, and library that seeks truth through reason and observation. It was the seed from which so much of our intellectual world has grown.
That's absolutely incredible, Dr. Rhys. Just imagining the footsteps of Aristotle echoing through that space gives me chills. Now, continuing with the Lyceum, could you tell us what subjects were actually taught there? What kind of knowledge did Aristotle and his students explore within those shaded walkways and gardens?
Another great question, Emma, because the Lyceum wasn't just a school in the conventional sense. It was more like a research institute, a university, and a think tank, all rolled into one, centuries ahead of his time. Aristotle envisioned a place where every aspect of knowledge could be examined, questioned, and built upon. And because of that, the range of subjects taught at the Lyceum was truly staggering. Let me give you an overview. 1. Philosophy. Of course, at the heart of it all was philosophy. Not just metaphysics or ethics, but logic, epistemology, and political philosophy. Aristotle and his students studied questions like, what is reality made of? What does it mean to live a good life? How should societies be structured? His work in logic, especially the development of formal reasoning through syllogisms, became foundational in Western thought. 2. Natural sciences. Aristotle was the first person in recorded history to systematically study biology, and this was a major part of the Lyceum's focus. They conducted observations, dissections, and classifications of animals and plants. Students at the Lyceum explored zoology, botany, anatomy, meteorology, geology. Aristotle's notes and lectures covered over 500 animal species, and his methods were shockingly close to the modern scientific method, even if the tools were ancient. 3. Psychology and the soul. He also delved into what we might now call psychology. His treatise De Anima, on the soul, was discussed and studied as a guide to understanding human perception, cognition, and behavior. He divided the soul into different faculties, the nutritive, sensitive, and rational, laying a foundation for future studies of the mind. 4. Ethics and political science. The Lyceum also tackled moral and political education. Aristotle's views on ethics, especially the doctrine of the mean, were taught alongside discussions of real-world governance. His famous work, Politics, examined different regimes, the nature of citizenship, and the responsibilities of rulers and the ruled. 5. Mathematics and astronomy. While not as central as in Plato's academy, mathematics and astronomy were still present in the Lyceum's curriculum. Aristotle viewed them as tools to understand the order and structure of the universe, even though he focused more on qualitative observation than quantitative abstraction. 6. Rhetoric and literature. Aristotle's work on rhetoric, how persuasion works, was a subject of study. His Rhetoric became a foundational text for speech, debate, and communication. Students learned how to craft arguments, analyze language, and understand poetry and drama, including Aristotle's famous commentary In Poetics. Finally, the Lyceum explored history, politics of different cultures, and comparative studies. Aristotle and his followers collected data on city-states, constitutions, and legal systems across the Greek world, almost like early political anthropology. So, Emma, to answer your question, the Lyceum was a multidisciplinary haven. It wasn't about specializing too early or in one narrow field. It was about asking the big questions, exploring the natural and moral worlds, and training the mind to observe, reason, and reflect. In many ways, it set the template for what we now expect from modern education, a place to think freely, deeply, and across boundaries. Aristotle didn't just teach knowledge, he taught the pursuit of wisdom, and that pursuit echoed in every subject he explored.
Dr. Rhys, after conducting all these episodes on Greek philosophers, I'm really beginning to realize just how central education was to their society. It seems like it wasn't just a part of their culture, it was a core pillar of it. Would you agree? How important was education in ancient Greek society, especially in the eyes of philosophers like Aristotle?
Absolutely, Emma. You've hit the nail on the head. For thinkers like Aristotle, education wasn't optional. It was essential to both personal development and the stability of society. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, education was seen as the foundation of citizenship, ethics, and rational discourse. Aristotle believed that a just society could only exist if its people were well-educated, morally grounded, and intellectually equipped to make wise decisions. Education, for them, wasn't just about acquiring knowledge. It was about shaping character, understanding virtue, and preparing individuals to live well and contribute meaningfully to their communities. So yes, in many ways, it was the backbone of Greek civilization.
Dr. Rhys, Aristotle lived over 2,300 years ago, yet so many of his ideas still seem to echo through time. What are some of the key lessons we can draw from his thinking in our modern world? And where do we still hear or feel the influence of Aristotle today?
That's a profound question, Emma, and one I always appreciate answering, because it allows us to see just how deeply Aristotle's legacy is woven into the fabric of our modern lives. Even though he lived over 2,300 years ago, Aristotle's ideas continue to influence how we think, how we learn, how we govern, and even how we live ethically. He's not just a figure of the past, he's a quiet presence in many of our most fundamental beliefs and institutions today. 1. In education. Let's start with education because we were just discussing it. Aristotle believed that education is the cornerstone of a good life and a just society. His belief that students should develop both intellect and character forms the basis of many modern educational models. The liberal arts curriculum in universities, where students study philosophy, science, politics, and ethics, echoes Aristotle's holistic approach.
He taught that no subject existed in isolation, and true wisdom came from understanding how everything is interconnected. In science and research, modern science, although far more advanced now, owes a great debt to Aristotle's empirical spirit. His idea that we must observe nature, form hypotheses, and categorize knowledge laid the groundwork for what we now call the scientific method. His contributions to biology, zoology, psychology, and logic were not only pioneering, they shaped centuries of scientific inquiry. And even when his theories were later revised, the framework he introduced, that the world can be understood through reasoned investigation, remains a foundation of science today. In ethics and personal development, when it comes to ethics, Aristotle's idea that a good life is one of virtue and purpose is more relevant than ever. In today's fast-paced, consumer-driven world, his emphasis on balance, self-awareness, and the cultivation of good habits offers a timeless guide to personal fulfillment. People often return to Aristotle when they seek answers to life's big questions, not about what to do in one moment, but how to live well consistently over time. In politics, Aristotle's belief in citizen participation, rule of law, and the balance of power still shapes democratic ideals. His analysis of different regimes, his call for moderation, and his focus on the common good continue to influence political theory and civic discourse. Even the idea that a healthy middle class stabilizes society was introduced by Aristotle, an insight we still debate and apply in modern governance. And in our everyday language and reasoning. And let's not forget logic. Every time we construct a sound argument, use critical thinking, or detect a fallacy, we're drawing on Aristotelian logic. His system of reasoning is embedded in law, debate, academic writing, and even artificial intelligence algorithms. And finally, Aristotle's presence is felt in our intellectual DNA. Whether we're studying medicine, ethics, literature, or leadership, we're engaging, often unknowingly, with frameworks that he helped establish. So, to answer your question, Emma, where do we still hear Aristotle? We hear him in classrooms, in parliaments, in laboratories, in books, and even in quiet moments of self-reflection. He reminds us that life is not just to be lived, it is to be understood. And that understanding comes through reason, observation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. He doesn't just belong to history. He belongs to humanity.
And now, Dr. Rhys, as has become something of a tradition on our podcast, I'd love to ask you one last question. Do you have a favorite quote by Aristotle? And if so, why does it resonate with you personally?
Emma, I absolutely love that this has become our tradition. And yes, I do have a favorite quote from Aristotle. It's simple, yet it carries an extraordinary weight. He once said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." This quote resonates deeply with me, not just as a philosopher or educator, but as a human being navigating everyday life. It reminds us that greatness, whether moral, intellectual, or personal, doesn't come from one grand gesture. It comes from the small, consistent choices we make every day. It's not about being perfect. It's about striving to be better, building character, one action at a time. In a world that often seeks instant success or quick answers, Aristotle gently pulls us back to a more grounded truth, that who we are is defined by what we choose to do, again and again. And that speaks to me on a very personal level, because it means there's always room to grow, to refine, and to move closer to the best version of ourselves. Aristotle believed that the path to excellence was open to all, but it required commitment, mindfulness, and purpose. And that, I think, is a message we all need. Timeless, empowering, and incredibly human.
And with that truly inspiring reflection, we come to the end of yet another deep and meaningful journey through the life and legacy of one of history's greatest thinkers, Aristotle. Dr. Rhys, as always, thank you so much for sharing your incredible knowledge, your insights, and the clarity with which you make these ancient ideas feel so alive and relevant. It's been a privilege having you with us once again.
Thank you so much, Emma. As always, it's a true honor and joy to be part of this podcast. I deeply appreciate the thoughtful questions and the opportunity to share these timeless ideas.
And to our listeners, Thank you for being with us, for learning with us, and for keeping the spirit of philosophy alive in your hearts. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast with others. And don't forget to drop a comment. Tell us which of Aristotle's philosophies resonated most with you, and what quote or lesson you'll carry forward from this episode. And of course, let us know which philosopher you'd like us to explore next with Dr. Rhys. Your feedback shapes the future of this podcast. Until next time, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and remember, history always speaks first, if only we choose to listen. Take care and goodbye.